Ma'am, step away from the vehicle now. The words landed sharp and final, cutting through the late afternoon air of the shopping plaza like a blade you couldn't see but could feel, and for a second, everything around Danielle Carter seemed to slow just enough for her to notice the small things. The hum of a distant car engine idling, the soft rattle of a shopping cart rolling across uneven asphalt, the way the sun reflected off the windshield beside her and flickered across her eyes. Her hand, still resting on the driver's side door handle of her dark blue sedan, paused mid-motion, fingers slightly curled, not out of fear, but out of calculation, as if her body was deciding which version of this moment it was about to step into. She turned her head slowly, not abruptly, not defensively, just enough to meet the voice behind her, and saw him. Officer Ryan Blake, standing a few feet away, posture firm, one hand resting near his belt, the other gesturing toward her with practiced authority, the kind that didn't ask for understanding, only compliance. Around them, the world didn't stop, but it shifted. Two people near the entrance of the store slowed their steps. A man loading groceries into his trunk paused with a carton of eggs in his hand, and somewhere behind Danielle, a car door shut with a hollow thud that echoed a little too loudly. She straightened, shoulders relaxed but grounded, the strap of her leather tote still hanging from her arm, her breathing even, controlled, as if she had already been here before in ways no one else in that parking lot could see. The officer took a step closer, his shadow stretching across the pavement until it touched the edge of her shoes, and in that small overlap of light and dark, something unspoken settled into place. An assumption, a judgment, a story already written before she had said a single word. "We've had a report," he continued, voice steady, rehearsed, "of merchandise being taken without payment." And the phrase hung in the air, heavier than it should have been, heavier than the simple words themselves, as if it carried more than just an accusation. Danielle didn't respond right away, not because she didn't have words, but because she chose the space before them, the silence that let the moment reveal itself fully. Her eyes moved briefly, not nervously, but observantly, taking in the angles of the scene, the store sign glowing faintly behind them, the reflection of herself in the car window, the way the officer's grip tightened just slightly when she didn't immediately comply. A breeze passed through, light but noticeable, brushing against her face and lifting a loose strand of hair, and for a fraction of a second, it felt like the only honest thing in the entire moment. "Ma'am," he repeated, firmer now, "I'm going to need you to step away and place your hands where I can see them." And there it was again, that narrowing of options, that quiet push toward a version of her he had already decided existed. Danielle slowly removed her hand from the car door, letting it fall naturally to her side before lifting both hands just enough to be visible, her movements deliberate, controlled, not submissive but precise, like someone who understood the weight of being watched. A phone appeared in the corner of her vision, someone recording now, and the awareness of it didn't change her posture, didn't alter her breathing, but it did deepen the silence around her, turning the moment into something that would live beyond itself. She finally spoke, her voice calm, steady, carrying neither anger nor fear, but something far more unsettling in its quiet certainty. "Officer, before we go any further, I'd like you to be absolutely sure about what you're doing." Danielle Carter did not lower her hands right away, but she did not raise them any higher either, holding them at a level that was visible, steady, and intentional. Her fingers relaxed instead of stiff, as if she refused to let the moment dictate the shape of her body. Her gaze remained on Officer Blake, not confrontational, not submissive, just present. The kind of presence that did not rush to defend itself because it understood something deeper than the accusation itself. The officer shifted, his weight slightly, a subtle movement, but enough to reveal the tension beneath his controlled exterior, as though her calm was not aligning with the outcome he expected. "We can sort that out after we verify a few things," he said, his tone flattening, leaning into procedure, into structure, into the script that allowed him to stay certain. Danielle gave a small nod, not agreement, but acknowledgement, and slowly turned her body just enough to face him more directly, the sunlight catching the edge of her cheekbone and outlining her profile against the metallic blue of her car. "Of course," she replied, her voice even, measured, each word placed carefully. But clarity matters, especially when a situation begins with an assumption. And the sentence did not rise, did not challenge, but it lingered in the air with a weight that made the silence afterward feel deliberate rather than empty. Behind them, a woman near the storefront whispered something under her breath, and another person lifted their phone a little higher, framing the scene as if it were already a story worth telling. Officer Blake exhaled through his nose, the sound quiet but sharp, and gestured toward the hood of the car. "I am going to need you to set your bag down and step over here." And this time there was less room for interpretation, less space between instruction and expectation. Danielle glanced down at her tote. The worn leather softened by years of use. The strap slightly creased where it rested, against her arm, and for a moment her hand hovered near it, not hesitating out of fear, but considering the motion itself, the meaning it would carry once performed. She placed it gently on the hood, not dropped, not tossed, the movement controlled, almost careful, as though even the way the bag touched the surface mattered. The faint thud echoed against the metal and seemed louder than it should have been. She stepped forward, one pace, then another, stopping where he indicated the distance between them, now defined not just by space, but by authority. "Do you have a receipt for the items you purchased?" he asked, his eyes briefly flicking toward the store behind her, then back to her face, scanning, searching, confirming something only he could see. Danielle's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened, not with anger, but with awareness, as if she recognized the pattern unfolding in real time. "Yes," she said simply. "It is in my bag," and she gestured lightly toward it, her movements still slow, still deliberate, refusing to match the urgency that had been imposed on her. The officer nodded once, curt, and stepped closer to the hood, his hand reaching toward the bag, pausing for just a fraction of a second before touching it, as though even he felt the weight of crossing that invisible line between suspicion and action. The parking lot seemed to tighten around them, the sounds of distant traffic dulling, conversations lowering into murmurs, the air itself feeling thicker, heavier, as if it were holding its breath along with everyone else. Danielle stood still, shoulders squared but relaxed, her posture grounded in a way that did not seek to prove innocence, but to remain intact within the moment. She watched as his fingers curled around the zipper of her bag, the small metallic pull catching the sunlight for a brief second before disappearing beneath his hand, and in that fleeting glint, something almost symbolic flickered: control, assumption, authority, all condensed into a single motion about to unfold. "I am going to take a look," he said, more to assert than to inform, and Danielle gave a slight nod, her voice quiet but unmistakably clear as it followed. "Then please make sure you look carefully." And the words did not challenge him, did not accuse, but they settled into the space between them with a precision that suggested this moment was not as simple as it appeared, not for him, not for her, and certainly not for what was about to come. Officer Blake pulled the zipper open in one smooth motion, the metallic teeth parting with a soft, deliberate sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the thickened air of the parking lot. And for a moment, his hand hovered just above the opening, as if he expected something immediate, something obvious, something that would confirm the version of events already forming in his mind. Danielle Carter did not move, her hands still visible, her posture unchanged, but her eyes followed the motion closely, not with fear, not with resistance, but with a quiet attentiveness that made the moment feel measured rather than chaotic. The officer reached inside, shifting items with controlled efficiency, the rustle of paper and fabric filling the silence between them, each movement precise, practiced, as though he had done this countless times before and expected the same outcome every time. He pulled out a small boxed item first, turning it slightly in his hand, examining it, then placing it on the hood beside the bag, followed by a second item, then a third, each one set down in a neat, almost methodical line, as if organizing evidence rather than belongings. The sunlight reflected off the glossy packaging, catching the edges, and casting faint glimmers across the surface of the car, and for a brief second, the scene looked almost ordinary, like someone unpacking groceries, except for the tension that pressed into every movement. "These were purchased today?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with something that sounded less like a question and more like a test. "Yes," Danielle replied, her tone unchanged, her words simple, direct, leaving no room for interpretation, yet offering no unnecessary explanation. "Officer." Blake glanced toward the store again, then back at the items, his brow tightening slightly, as if the absence of immediate contradiction unsettled him more than confirmation would have. He reached back into the bag, his fingers brushing against a folded piece of paper, and he paused, just for a fraction of a second, before pulling it out. The receipt unfolded between his hands, the thin paper catching the light, its printed lines faint but visible, and he scanned it quickly, his eyes moving from one line to the next, his lips pressing together as he processed what he was seeing. Behind them, the low murmur of onlookers shifted, a subtle change in tone, curiosity blending with anticipation, as if the crowd sensed that something was not aligning the way it was supposed to. Danielle watched him read, her breathing steady, her shoulders relaxed, but there was a stillness about her now that felt deeper, more grounded, as if she had stepped fully into the center of the moment without needing to control it. The officer looked up briefly, his gaze meeting hers for a split second before dropping back to the receipt, then to the items, then back again, a small loop of uncertainty beginning to form in the rhythm of his movements. "The timestamps match," he said quietly, almost to himself, though the words carried just enough to be heard, and he cleared his throat lightly, adjusting his stance as if resetting his position within the scene. The edges of his certainty began to soften, not collapsing, but shifting, like something rigid encountering resistance it did not expect. He placed the receipt down beside the items, his hand lingering on the paper a moment longer than necessary, and then withdrew it slowly. The air between them changed, not dramatically, but noticeably, the tension no longer sharp and pointed, but diffused, uncertain, searching for a new direction. Danielle tilted her head slightly, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement of the shift, her voice calm as she spoke again. "Is there anything else you need to verify, officer?" And the question did not press, did not accuse, but it held a quiet weight, one that invited him to reconsider not just the contents of the bag, but the foundation of the situation itself. Officer Blake inhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling as he looked at the items once more, then at the small gathering of people now clearly watching, their phones still raised, their attention fixed, and for the first time since the moment began, his posture lost a fraction of its rigidity, just enough to reveal that something inside the narrative he had been following was no longer holding together the way it once had. Officer Blake's fingers hovered just above the receipt as if the thin strip of paper had suddenly gained weight, his eyes tracing the printed lines again, slower this time, more deliberate, as though searching for a mistake that refused to appear. The neat row of items on the hood no longer looked like evidence, just ordinary purchases arranged under an extraordinary assumption, and that shift, subtle but undeniable, began to press into the edges of his composure. He straightened slightly, clearing his throat again, but the sound felt less controlled now, less certain, and when he spoke, the authority in his voice carried a faint strain beneath it. "We received a call from inside the store," he said, glancing briefly toward the entrance, "reporting suspicious behavior," and the phrase seemed to stretch thinner in the air than it had moments ago. Danielle Carter did not immediately respond, her gaze following his glance toward the store before returning to him, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet depth behind her eyes now, something that suggested she was not only present in the moment, but fully aware of its shape, its direction, and its implications. "Suspicious," she repeated softly, not as a challenge, but as a reflection, letting the words settle between them like something that needed to be examined rather than accepted. A car passed slowly behind the growing circle of onlookers, its tires rolling over gravel with a soft crunch, and somewhere nearby, a child's voice asked a question that was quickly hushed, the sound fading into the background of a scene that had become increasingly focused, increasingly contained. Officer Blake shifted his stance again, his hand moving to rest on his hip, not out of habit this time, but as if anchoring himself, and he gestured lightly toward the items. "Sometimes people carry receipts after the fact," he added, the explanation sounding more like a justification than a conclusion. "It does not always confirm the full picture." And even as he said it, his eyes flicked once more to the timestamp, to the matching details, to the alignment that refused to break. Danielle listened without interruption, her posture steady, her hands still visible. But there was a slight change now, not in her stance, but in the way she held the silence afterward, allowing it to stretch just long enough to reveal the gap between what was said and what was true. Then perhaps the full picture requires more than assumption, she replied, her voice calm, measured, each word placed with quiet precision, not raised, not sharpened, but carrying a clarity that made it difficult to dismiss. The officer's jaw tightened slightly, a reflex more than a decision, and he looked past her for a moment, taking in the faces around them, the phone still raised, the attention unwavering, and the awareness of being observed seemed to settle onto him like an additional layer he had not accounted for. The weight of the moment was no longer one-sided, no longer resting solely on Danielle, but beginning to shift, to distribute itself across the scene in a way that altered its balance. He stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but recalibrating, and his eyes moved again to her face, searching, reassessing, as though the person standing in front of him no longer matched the initial report that had set everything in motion. "Can you explain your actions inside the store?" he asked, the question more structured now, more procedural, as if he were trying to rebuild a framework that had begun to fracture. Danielle's gaze remained steady, and for the first time, there was a faint trace of something beneath her calm. Not irritation, not fear, but a quiet resolve, something grounded and unshaken. "I selected items," she said evenly. "I paid for them at the register, and I walked out." Each step of her statement clear, simple, unembellished, leaving no space for misinterpretation, and yet carrying an undercurrent that pointed beyond the obvious. The breeze returned, lighter this time, brushing across the surface of the car and shifting the edge of the receipt just slightly, the paper lifting and settling again as if even it responded to the tension in the air. Officer Blake watched that small movement, then looked back at Danielle, and in that moment, the certainty that had driven his actions began to thin further, not disappearing, but losing its sharpness, its confidence, its unquestioned authority. The narrative he had stepped into was no longer holding its shape, and though he had not yet said it, not yet acknowledged it, the shift was there, visible in the slight hesitation before his next breath, in the way his shoulders no longer squared as firmly, in the silence that followed her words and refused to resolve itself as easily as before. The silence stretched longer this time, not empty, but heavy, as if every second carried weight that neither of them could easily set down, and Officer Blake felt it pressing against his chest in a way that had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with perception. He looked again at the receipt, then at the items, then back at Danielle Carter, and something in his expression shifted, not fully visible, but present enough to disrupt the certainty he had held just minutes earlier. Behind him, one of the bystanders stepped slightly to the side, adjusting their angle, the faint sound of a phone camera refocusing cutting through the quiet, and that small, almost insignificant noise seemed to echo louder than it should have, reminding him that this moment was no longer contained, no longer private, no longer something that would disappear once resolved. "The store employee was very clear," he said finally, though the firmness in his voice felt constructed now, like something being rebuilt in real time. "They said you were moving quickly, avoiding eye contact, placing items into your bag before reaching the register." And the words, once confident, now carried a subtle hesitation, as if he were hearing them differently as he spoke them aloud. Danielle did not react immediately, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, but there was a stillness about her that felt deeper than before, as if she had settled into the center of the moment with full awareness of how it was unfolding. "Is that what you were told?" she asked. Quietly, not as a challenge, but as a clarification, her voice calm, precise, and the question itself seemed to redirect the focus, shifting it away from her actions and toward the source of the narrative. Officer Blake nodded once, but the motion was slower, less decisive, and his eyes briefly flicked toward the store again, as if reconsidering the reliability of what had been reported. "And did you verify that before approaching me?" Danielle continued, her tone unchanged, each word placed carefully, not pressing, not accusing, but but carrying a quiet insistence on accountability. The question lingered, stretching into the space between them, and for a moment, he did not answer, not because he could not, but because the answer no longer fit as cleanly as it once had. The air shifted again, the tension no longer sharp but dense, layered, and the crowd seemed to lean in without moving, their attention tightening around the exchange. Officer Blake exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping. Just a fraction, and he adjusted his stance, no longer squared in the same rigid alignment. "We act on reasonable suspicion," he said, the phrase sounding more procedural than personal, as if he were stepping back into policy to steady himself. "We do not always have the full picture at the start." And the explanation hung there, valid on its surface, but increasingly fragile beneath it. Danielle gave a slight nod, acknowledging the statement without endorsing it, and her eyes moved briefly to the items laid out on the hood, then back to him, her expression composed. But there was a subtle shift now, something firmer, more grounded, as if the line between observation and response was beginning to narrow. "Then it becomes important," she said softly, "to recognize when the picture changes," and the words did not rise in volume, but they carried a weight that settled into the moment with quiet authority. The officer's jaw tightened again, but this time it was not reflexive, it was restrained, controlled, as if he were holding back a response that no longer felt appropriate. He looked at the receipt once more, then at the bag, then at the small crowd, and the awareness of being watched seemed to press more heavily now, not as pressure from outside, but as a reflection of what the situation had become. The narrative had shifted, and he could feel it, even if he had not yet fully acknowledged it. Danielle remained still, her hands lowering slightly now, not in surrender, but in natural movement, her body no longer confined by the initial command, and the subtle change went unchallenged, unnoticed even by the officer, whose focus had begun to turn inward, recalibrating, reassessing. The late afternoon light softened as the sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the pavement, and in that changing light, the scene itself seemed to transform, no longer defined by accusation, but by the quiet unraveling of it. Officer Blake drew in another breath, slower this time, deeper, and when he looked at Danielle again, there was something different in his gaze, something less certain, less fixed, as though he were beginning to see not just the situation, but the person standing in front of him, and realizing, perhaps for the first time, that the two did not align the way he had assumed. The moment did not break, it softened, stretching outward in a way that made every sound feel distant, like the world had stepped back just enough to let the truth breathe, and Danielle Carter stood there with a stillness that no longer belonged to the situation, but to something deeper, something rooted far beyond the parking lot, beyond the watching eyes, beyond the assumptions that had brought them here. The late afternoon sun dipped lower, its light no longer sharp but warm, brushing across the hood of the car and illuminating the scattered items, the receipt, the open bag, turning ordinary objects into quiet witnesses of a moment that had already begun to change shape. Officer Blake did not speak, not immediately, his gaze fixed somewhere between the items and Danielle, as if he were trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer aligned. And the space between his thoughts showed in the way his shoulders eased slightly, the rigid structure of authority loosening into something uncertain, something human. A breeze moved through again, gentle this time, lifting the edge of the receipt just enough for it to flutter before settling back down. And that small movement seemed to echo the shift in the air, a subtle reminder that nothing in this moment was as fixed as it had first appeared. Danielle lowered her hands fully now, not abruptly, but naturally, as if her body had decided the moment no longer required them to remain suspended, and the absence of any objection from the officer made that movement even more significant, an unspoken acknowledgement that the balance had shifted. Her fingers brushed lightly against the side of her coat, a grounding motion, almost imperceptible, but steady, controlled, intentional. She inhaled slowly, the breath filling her chest with quiet strength, and as she exhaled, her gaze lifted slightly, not above him, not away, but through the moment itself, as if she could see beyond the surface of what was happening around them. The crowd had grown quieter, the earlier murmurs replaced by a silence that felt attentive rather than curious. as if everyone present understood, on some level, that they were witnessing not just an interaction, but a turning point, something intangible yet undeniable. A car in the distance started and then stopped again, the sound fading quickly, leaving behind a stillness that seemed almost deliberate. Officer Blake shifted his weight. Once more, but this time the movement was slower, less reactive, and more reflective, his hand dropping from his hip to rest loosely at his side, no longer anchored in the posture he had arrived with. He glanced again at the receipt, then at Danielle, and for a moment, his expression softened, not fully, not openly, but enough to reveal the beginning of recognition, the quiet realization that the situation had moved beyond the boundaries of his initial understanding. Danielle did not press the moment, did not fill the silence with words, allowing it to remain as it was, open, unresolved, but no longer tense in the same way. And in that restraint, there was a kind of strength that did not need to assert itself to be felt. The light continued to shift, casting longer shadows across the pavement, stretching the outlines of both of them until they nearly touched, merging briefly before separating again. And in that fleeting overlap, something unspoken passed between them, not agreement, not resolution, but awareness, the kind that does not arrive loudly, but settles in quietly, altering everything that follows. Danielle's eyes moved once more across the scene, taking in the details, the reflection of the sky in the car window, the stillness of the items on the hood, the subtle tension in the officer's posture, and then returned to him, her expression calm, composed, but now carrying a quiet certainty that had not been visible before, as if the moment itself had revealed something that no explanation could replace. And in that silence, that shared pause between action and understanding, the story that had begun with accusation stood on the edge of something else entirely, something neither of them had fully named yet, but both could now feel. The sound came from behind them before anyone moved, the low hum of an engine pulling into the lot, smooth and deliberate, not rushed, not uncertain. And as the black sedan rolled to a quiet stop a few yards away, something in the atmosphere shifted again, not sharply this time, but with a quiet gravity that drew attention without asking for it. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his movements precise, purposeful, his eyes scanning the scene, with immediate focus before landing on Danielle Carter. And in that instant, recognition replaced observation. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear, respectful, cutting cleanly through the silence, and the words did not rise in volume, but they carried across the space with undeniable weight. Everything paused, not dramatically, but completely, as if the moment itself had taken a breath and chosen not to release it. Officer Blake's posture shifted before his mind could catch up, a subtle straightening, a reflex that belonged to a different understanding of authority, and his eyes moved quickly from the man to Danielle, searching her face again, but now through a different lens, one that no longer aligned with the assumptions that had brought him here. Danielle did not react immediately, her expression unchanged, her gaze steady, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in the way she turned slightly toward the man, a recognition that did not need to be announced. The man approached, stopping at a respectful distance, his attention fixed on her. "We have been trying to reach you," he continued, his tone controlled but carrying a trace of urgency beneath it. The hearing was moved up, and the clerk could not get confirmation, and the words, simple and professional, unfolded naturally, without hesitation, without performance, reinforcing what had already been said without needing to explain it. The crowd responded first, not with sound, but with stillness, the phone still, raised but now held differently, as if the story they thought they were capturing had changed direction entirely. Officer Blake's hand dropped fully to his side now, no longer resting near his belt, no longer anchored in command, and for a moment, he said nothing, the silence around him no longer controlled, but revealing. His gaze moved once more to the items on the hood, the receipt, the open bag, each detail now reframed, no longer evidence, no longer suspicion, but context, incomplete and misread. Danielle finally spoke, her voice calm, even, carrying no trace of triumph, no edge of correction, just clarity. "I will be there shortly," she said. To the man, her tone steady, professional, as if the moment they stood in was simply an interruption, not a disruption. The man nodded once, stepping back slightly, his presence remaining, but no longer pressing forward. Officer Blake inhaled, the breath slower now, heavier, and when he looked at her again, the shift was undeniable, not just in posture, but in perception, as though the person in front of him had come into focus all at once, replacing the version he had constructed minutes earlier. "Ma'am," he began, but the word felt insufficient, incomplete, and he paused, the rest of the sentence catching somewhere between intention and realization. Danielle met his gaze, not with expectation, not with demand, but with a quiet steadiness that held the moment in place without forcing it to resolve. The late sunlight caught the edge of her profile again, illuminating her face in a way that felt almost symbolic, not dramatic, but clear, and in that light, the contrast between what had been assumed and what was now undeniable stood without needing to be spoken. The parking lot remained still, the earlier noise replaced by a silence that no longer belonged to tension, but to recognition, and in that silence, the truth settled fully into place, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a weight that could not be ignored. Officer Blake's voice did not come immediately, and when it did, it was quieter than before, stripped of the sharp edges that had defined it earlier, as though each word now had to pass through something heavier before it could be spoken. I apologize," he said, the pause between the words revealing more than the words themselves, and his gaze did not drift, did not avoid, but stayed on Danielle Carter with a steadiness that was no longer about control, but about acknowledgement. The air around them shifted again, not with tension this time, but with something softer, something that carried the weight of realization settling into place. Danielle looked at him, her expression unchanged, but there was a depth there now, something that reflected not just the moment, but everything that had led to it, everything that had been assumed, imposed, and now undone. She did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to exist, to hold the apology in its full shape without rushing to fill it. Behind them, the small crowd had grown still in a different way, no longer leaning forward in curiosity, but holding back, as if aware that what was happening now did not belong to them. Officer Blake shifted his stance slightly, his shoulders no longer squared in authority, but lowered, grounded, his hand moving briefly toward the items on the hood before stopping, as though unsure whether to touch them again. "I should have verified before approaching you like that," he continued, his tone more measured now, each sentence carrying a careful awareness of itself. "I acted on incomplete information, and the admission, simple as it was, seemed to carry more weight than any justification could have." Danielle's eyes moved briefly to the items on the hood, then to the receipt, then back to him, her gaze steady, calm, but no longer distant, as if she had stepped closer to the moment without physically moving. "Information is only part of it," she said quietly, her voice even, without accusation, without sharpness, but with a clarity that settled into the space between them. "How it is interpreted matters just as much." And the words did not rise, did not press, but they carried a quiet authority that did not need volume to be felt. The officer nodded slightly, the motion small but genuine, and for a moment, he looked down, not in avoidance, but in reflection, as if tracing back through the steps that had led him here and seeing them differently now. The late sunlight continued to soften, casting a warm glow across the scene, the long shadows stretching further, blurring the edges between objects, between people, between the roles they had occupied just minutes before. Danielle reached forward then, not abruptly, but with the same measured calm that had defined her throughout, and picked up the receipt, folding it carefully along its original crease before placing it back into her bag, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as if reclaiming not just her belongings, but the space that had been taken from her. She gathered the items next, one by one, placing them back inside, each motion quiet, controlled, and the simple act carried a weight that went beyond the objects themselves. Officer Blake stepped back half a pace, giving her space without being asked, his posture now fully shifted, no longer occupying the center of the moment, but standing within it, aware of its balance. "If there is anything I can do to make this right," he began, But the sentence trailed, not because he did not know how to finish it, but because he understood, perhaps for the first time, that not everything could be corrected through action. Danielle paused, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the bag, and looked at him again, her expression calm, composed, but carrying a quiet finality. "Do better next time," she said simply, and the words, though soft, landed with a weight that did not need emphasis. They were not a demand, not a reprimand, but a standard, one that extended beyond the moment itself. The officer nodded again, slower this time, absorbing the words rather than responding to them, and the silence that followed was no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but settled, grounded in a truth that had revealed itself fully. Around them, the world began to move again, subtle at first, the shifting of feet, the lowering of phones, the distant hum of traffic returning, and in that gradual return to motion, the moment remained, not as something loud or dramatic, but as something quiet and undeniable, something that would not easily be forgotten by anyone who had stood within it. Danielle Carter closed the zipper of her bag with a soft, final sound, the metallic line sealing not just the contents inside, but the moment itself, and for a second, her hand rested lightly on the top of it, fingers still, grounded, as if marking the end of something that had never needed to begin. The parking lot had begun to breathe again, the distant hum of engines returning, footsteps resuming, conversations picking up in low, cautious tones, but around her, there remained a quiet pocket of stillness that had not yet fully dissolved. She lifted the bag from the hood of the car, the leather settling naturally against her arm, and straightened, her posture effortless, composed, unchanged from the beginning, yet now carrying a clarity that had been sharpened by everything that had unfolded. Officer Blake stood a few feet away, no longer occupying the center of the space, his presence quieter, his stance less defined, and though he said nothing further, the weight of what had passed remained visible in the way he held himself, in the slight pause before each breath, in the absence of the certainty he had arrived with. Danielle did not look at him again immediately, not out of dismissal, but because the moment no longer required it, and instead, her gaze moved forward, toward the open space beyond the parking lot, toward the direction she had been headed before everything had shifted. The man in the charcoal suit waited near the sedan, his posture respectful, his presence steady, not pressing, not interrupting, simply ready. Danielle took a step, then another, her heels meeting the pavement with a soft, even rhythm, each movement unhurried, deliberate, and the distance between her and the scene behind her widened without resistance. The long shadows stretched across the asphalt, following her briefly before breaking apart, and the late afternoon light traced along her path, warm and steady, illuminating the quiet strength in her stride. Behind her, the small crowd began to disperse, phones lowering, conversations resuming, the moment already shifting into memory, into something that would be spoken about, replayed, reflected upon. Officer Blake remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze following her, not with authority, not with suspicion, but with something quieter, something that lingered, as if the silence she left behind carried more than any words could have. Danielle reached the car, the driver opening the rear door for her, and she paused just briefly, her hand resting on the edge of the door, her eyes lifting once toward the horizon where the light softened into evening. There was no smile, no visible reaction, just a stillness, a breath, a moment of quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be shared. She stepped inside, the door closing gently behind her, the sound soft but complete, and the car began to move, pulling away from the curb with a smooth, controlled motion, merging into the flow of the world that had already begun to move forward. The parking lot returned to its ordinary rhythm, the echoes of what had happened fading into the background, but not disappearing, not entirely. And in the space she left behind, in the quiet that followed her absence, there remained something intangible, something steady and undeniable, like a truth that did not need to speak to be heard, resting in the air long after she was gone.